we expect over the next 10 years something like $70 trillion will be passed on from one generation to the next, creating an inherited plutocracy. So there's a climate emergency, and there's an inequality emergency. Inequality is a choice. It is something we can do something about. And the second is, if we're going to do something about it, we have to do it on the basis of knowledge.
It correctly asserts that inequality is, in the end, a betrayal of people's dignity, an impediment to inclusive growth, and a threat to democracy itself. So we have the means to build a fair and a just and equal world.
That, of course, was President Cyril Ramaphosa and Professor Joseph Stiglitz discussing the report on the G20 Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Faraz Patel and welcome to Mzansi Welcomes the World. This is our G20 preview show as we look ahead to the Leaders Summit, which will be taking place between November the 22nd and November the 23rd. What was that report about? Well, of course, as the world's major economies convenes under the G20 banner, one of the most pressing issues confronting global leaders is the widening gap between the rich and the poor. And this report was seemingly the one which would address the inequality that much of the world is going through right now. To unpack this report, I'd like to welcome Thoko Madonko, who is a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. Thoko, good evening. Absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us on Mzansi Welcomes the World.
Good evening, Faraz, and good evening to your viewers.
Absolute pleasure to have you on. Thoko, on reviewing this report from a Southern Center for Inequality's perspective, what was your initial reaction to it and your overview with regards to this?
You know, it's important that reports like this get published because it highlights what we all experience on a daily basis, that we know that there is something fundamentally wrong in our societies when we have children asking for money or food at the side of the road, or we have people that are having to work 2 to 3 jobs just to get by. So there is a crisis of inequality in the world and in South Africa. And we need global leaders to take this seriously because it has both economic and democratic consequences if we don't deal with it.
Thoko, this, of course, is happening as we move close to 2 weeks before the Leaders Summit. And of course, I will touch on this in a bit with regards to what recommendations President Cyril Ramaphosa has put through. But one of the discussion was this would be one of the topics that has to be discussed during the Leaders Summit. I'd like to think that they're not ignorant of this. They probably know how much of the inequality has been around for the last 2 decades. My question is this too late, or do we still have time to address this at this upcoming summit?
It's a pivotal time now because essentially we need South Africa to close the loop on the Global South conversation as the G20 leadership coming from Brazil from last year. And also we hand over to the United States, Global North, and often they don't take seriously the issues that affect Global South. And inequality is affecting the Global South in particular, or global majority, however you want to term it. And so it is not, sustainable to have the richest 1% of the global population capturing 41% of new wealth since 2000. And so we see within the conversations taking place within the G20 and the various arms or bodies within that, the Y20, Youth 20, the Women's 20, the Technical 20, and Business 20, and so forth, that all of these sectors are touching on both, as in your inset talked about the climate crisis, but also the inequality crisis through the lens of talking about taxing wealth, for example, looking at more coherent redistribution programs, the role of public services in providing stimulus to economies, the importance of supporting public services, the importance of rolling out affordable healthcare and education. All of these issues are core to talking about dealing with inequality and addressing inequality. And so it's absolutely critical that this G20 leaves and hands over a very firm global South position that says that we need to address inequality once and for all. And we do so through various progressive mechanisms like a wealth on tax, like protecting public services, dealing with the climate crisis, and increasingly now dealing with armed and war and violence. So those are the kinds of things that within the various kind of arms and the role of young people in this story becomes very important. And so we should see a very strong statement about dealing with excessive wealth, but also poverty and inequality.
Thoko, I just want to mention an important part of it was, discussed in this report. It says that 83% of all countries, accounting for 90% of the world's populations, meets the World Bank's definition of high inequality. Countries with high inequality are 7 times more likely to experience, and this I think is quite an interesting one, democratic decline more than equal countries. When I first read this, I thought, okay, what does this mean for democracy? In your view, what does this mean for democracy? Should there be a concern with regards to this?
Absolutely. The research is clear. History has shown that with high levels of inequality, it is very difficult to maintain social cohesion. Communities turn on each other. Often poor communities will turn on poorer communities, so it becomes a kind of dog-eat-dog world, which makes you spend more on policing and armed, and it becomes a vicious cycle. It also distorts politics. So when you have too much money in politics, it distorts the priorities and needs of the broader populations that are affected in highly unequal societies, and often is skewed towards away from the needs of the majority to the needs of the few, which are often very luxury-related kinds of things, rather than broad-based public transport, public education, public health, those kinds of things that allow for social cohesion. Essentially, a millionaire should be riding a public bus just as somebody who's earning an average wage.
Thoko, the next question, and I want to spend a bit of time on this because, I know that the Southern Center for Inequality Studies has been doing a lot of reports with regards to the domestic parts. I just want to start off from the domestic part. And from an African perspective, and specifically with South Africa's G20 presidency, how can this report affect us domestically? Let's start with the domestic one. We are the most unequal country in the world right now. And I'd like to think that it's good to sweep your own front door before going ahead and actually implementing this on a global level. Because South Africa still hasn't dealt with the unequal society that we have in this country right now.
Absolutely. And it's important that the president takes leadership on this, but also all political parties need to take leadership on this, because ultimately, as we've talked about, this affects social cohesion. And so it's untenable for a large swathe of South Africans going hungry at night. This should not be happening in this day and age. We should not see, flood decimating people's livelihoods and losing their homes in such catastrophic ways, when in fact we could have resources tailored towards making sure that we can cope with more and more climate shocks that are going to keep happening. So from a domestic perspective, one of the key areas that I work on, which is on public finance and looking at our budget policies, is that we need to have budget policies that are geared towards addressing inequality explicitly. At the moment, our budget policies in the form of fiscal consolidation or austerity is actually geared towards increasing inequality. And we've seen that when you have budget cuts and you cut the overall envelope of the public sector, that exacerbates issues with unemployment, it lowers growth. So it's a completely distorted policy that we're following that doesn't actually tackle this question of inequality. So I'm hoping that this report will drive home the message to National Treasury in particular that it cannot be business as usual. They cannot keep implementing policies that exacerbate inequality as opposed to address inequality.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Thoko Madonko. We're going to be focusing on the rich getting richer, which this report has highlighted right over here, but this discussion about taxing them. And this was brought up in Brazil's G20 presidency last year. Can that be achieved? Well, we'll have that discussion after the break. Do stay tuned to Mzansi Welcomes the World. Welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. I'm in conversation with Thoko Madonko, who's a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. Again, thank you so much for staying with us, Thoko. Thoko, between the year 2000 and 2024, it's more than 2 decades, the richest 1% captured 41% of all new wealth, while the bottom 50% just gained 1%. I mean, those numbers are quite scary when you look at it. Now, during last year's Brazil G20 Summit, the calls, and there were loud calls for the super wealthy to be taxed around 1 to 2% to somehow find a way to bring this equality. Is this a realistic idea? Because it needs both to buy into it. Those who are poor will say, yes, please go ahead and do it, while the super rich will say, hold on a bit, this needs a bit of discussion.
Right. It's a hotly contested issue. And it is a political issue. It's an ideological issue. The core of taxation is about providing, the commons, so providing public services. But also, it's about redistributing wealth. So it's not just about delivering public services, but it's also about saying we want to keep our societies functioning in a particular way. And that can be done in various ways. The Swiss have been calling for a cap on executive pay, for example, as a kind of tax to say, you only pay a certain amount, and then that drives the companies to then have to increase their profits, which enables us to tax companies via their profits. So it's quite a complex story. So there's different mechanisms in which we could be tapping into wealth and redistributing that wealth so that we can provide quality public services. So politically, some are arguing that it's not possible to tax wealth. And the reality is it's not possible because wealthy people hold the power and hold the purse strings in most political environments. And so you are trying to expect a political administration to take on those that pay them in terms of public funding, in terms of party funding, that you are then going to turn around and tax them. So it becomes a very difficult issue politically. But whether it's feasible, absolutely. Wealth taxes are nothing new. This has been done throughout history. Even the US had some of the highest wealth taxes in the world at one point. And there was growth, by the way. There was enormous growth at the same time. So these arguments that it harms growth is just a myth. The argument that the rich people will run away is also a myth, because it's very unlikely that a rich person is going to run away with their wine farms in the case of a rich South African wine farmer, for example. We're talking ultra wealthy individuals as well. So there's also been a little bit of confusion about which level of wealth we're talking about. We're not talking about your average middle class person. We're talking your multi-millionaires and billionaires who have airplanes and yachts and multiple homes and paintings and fancy cars and so forth. All of those assets they have, and they also have assets, fixed assets in businesses. And it's very difficult to up and leave your factory. So even this idea that they will leave is also a bit of a myth. But also that can be dealt with, as the Brazilians speak about in the previous G20, was to talk about an international tax regime so that we have a kind of UN tax convention that then enables all countries to prevent this race to the bottom in which, companies and wealthy individuals can try and pit one country against another. So it is feasible and it can be done. And in the South African context, we have the information and data to already know who those high net worth individuals are and to get them to start paying their fair share. So we're not asking for half of their money. We're asking for a percentage or two of their wealth.
Yeah, just for context, it's not like you mentioned the middle class earners or the sort of working class. It's more the trillionaires, which we have quite a lot within the globe. Thoko, from the super wealthy, and they'll play probably the more diplomatic role in this, in saying, well, this hampers the investment that we want to put in the country. So if you want to go ahead and tax us, well, then countries which are yearning for investment will have to sort of bite the bullet with regards to this proposed wealth tax. How does one strike a balance with regards to that? So as much as countries would like investment, this idea of taxing the super wealthy needs to also be taken into consideration given the high inequality that the world faces right now.
So that's one of the biggest myths, actually, for us about investment. I mean, we don't have a high tax environment in South Africa, for example, but we have an investment strike. So, we might as well tax them then because they're sitting on that money and we need that money to be flowing in the economy. And we can do that through the public service. So research that we've done on austerity and the impacts of austerity budgeting is, in fact, by cutting government budgets and by reducing tax revenue through that mechanism, it actually harms investment. So you want to do a case of increasing investment through the state, but also taxing fairly and making sure that money flows through the economy. Because essentially what you want is money, a cash injection, so that people have money in their pockets, have access to jobs, and so forth. So this idea that by taxing the super wealthy, we're somehow going to stop them from investing is simply not true.
Thoko, one of the proposals, and it's going to be interesting to see whether this would actually see the light of day during the Leaders Summit, is the creation of an international panel on inequality. According to the report, it's an independent global body inspired by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They also mentioned that it would monitor global inequality, analyze its drivers and consequences, and also guide international and national policy making. My question is twofold. Can you see this proposal seeing the light of day? And the second, will it have the consistency?
Well, I hope that it sees the light of day because it's absolutely needed. The richness of the conversation about inequality is that it enables us to both pay attention to what happens in poor communities, how are they resilient, how do they manage, how do they cope, but it also shines a very bright light on how the wealthy are doing and behaving and engaging. So we can start seeing how resources are captured or distributed, and those conversations need to flow globally because we have international things that are affecting our ability to understand inequality. That's climate change, for example, but also the flow of, we live in a highly financialized environment, so the flow of money becomes important. And so these factors become critical to enabling us to have conversations that move beyond just aid, for example, but reparations, loss and damage becomes an important conversation in the issue around inequality. And then again, increasingly, as we see many northern countries expanding their military budgets, that we now need to talk about the effects of war and conflict and how that exacerbates inequality. And so we can then, internationally have a conversation about how to deal with this in a global solidarity way that affects, those that are really needing a voice on the platform of talking about what their experiences are like at this very moment.
Thoko, one final question. President Ramaphosa has described this report as a quote-unquote blueprint for greater equality and a key contribution to South Africa's G20 presidency. The tackling of inequality, is this going to be one of the defining moments or the defining moment for the presidency of Ramaphosa for this G20?
I hope so. And I hope that we see a change in our own medium-term budget policy statement, which is coming out next week, that also signals that we are ready to have fiscal policy that is going to tackle inequality. So I think it is absolutely commendable that this task force was put together under the leadership of Professor Stiglitz. I think it's absolutely critical that we reflect as South Africans, but also as global citizens within the G20, to talk about how can we address the crises, the multiple crises that we face, of which inequality is both a symptom and a cause.
Thoko Madonko, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us here on Mzansi Welcomes the World.
Thank you very much.
That's Thoko Madonko. She's a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. After the break, we're going to be shifting to a focus to another subcommittee within the G20, and that's Urban 20, as urbanization continues to grow and more people move from the rural areas and the townships to seek employment within the urban areas of South Africa. How does the U20, as it is summarized as, play a role in helping urbanization and helping South Africans deal with urbanization as they make that move there? My conversation with the Sherpa of the U20, Zaid Ibrahim, is after this break.